what would you say to someone who is afraid of being disappointed by God
Mm.
or feels discouraged because of previously unanswered prayers?
Yeah, no, this is such a good question. My first encouragement to them would be tell God those things. Tell God that you're afraid he's going to disappoint you. Tell God that you are disappointed because it doesn't seem like he showed up. And this is where it's fascinating what we do in our own minds in prayer. Because again, if you just read the Psalms, which are our guides to prayer, this is our prayer book of scripture. And if you read it, the psalmists are asking God these questions all the time. There's a psalm that demands to know if God's fallen asleep on the job. Like, that's a bold kind of prayer. There's all sorts of psalms that want to know why you've abandoned me. That God hasn't abandoned this person. Like, there's, and they're not necessarily naming true things in reality. They're naming the truth of their experience. And so we need to name the truth. And, one of the greatest examples of this in my mind, and my co-author for this book, John Coe, who's also my mentor, he has spent a ton of time exegeting Psalm 139. And it's so funny because this is always one of my favorite Psalms. And then I heard him teach on it and I was like, wow, I misread that. So like, wow, I was reading, because what I did as a high school student when I first came across this Psalm is I memorized parts of it. And I ignored all the weird part in the middle about like kill my enemies and stuff because I was like, I don't know what to do with that. So I'll just ignore that. And what he shows, I think, and I think he's totally right about this, is he shows that's the point of the psalm. Like the whole psalm is about that. So you have the Psalm 139 at the beginning, you have the psalmist's realization. I can't get away from you, God. You're everywhere I go. When I was in my mother's womb, you were there knitting me together. If I went down to Sheol, you would be there. If I cannot hide from you. And the question then becomes, well, why is the psalmist trying to get away from God? Well, it turns out he's got these feelings of anger. He's furious. So he's like, fine, here's what I want. I want to kill these people. And I think you should kill them. I think you want to go. And he just kind of unleashes himself at God. And then you have the famous ending where he kind of stops and he says, search me, oh God, test me and know my every thought. And and he's now just kind of holding these things open to God, saying, God, this is what I feel, but you know what? You need to test these. I can't test them. And I think for many of us, prayer has become a place where we try to do what's good and we try to do what's right. We have this idealized fantasy of how a good Christian should pray, and we try to act that out. And we forget that God knows it all already. So there's nothing we can say that could surprise God. But even there, what's amazing about this is that this isn't something we can just learn. So I think everyone knows that. Everyone knows we should be honest in prayer. And that's not a that's not a crazy belief. That is something that almost every Christian I know knows. Honesty, good in prayer. Dishonesty, bad in prayer. Like, that's a pretty clear sort of thing. The problem, though, is we go to pray and subconsciously we have these instincts that tell us God doesn't want to hear this, or maybe even God can't hear this. And I don't think we really know how deep that runs. And sometimes we even are vaguely aware God probably sees this in me, but I can't verbalize it. And what the Psalms teach us is that we need to verbalize the truth because God sees the truth and God calls us to pray about what he sees. And the advantage there is that that's where prayer, to use the title of the book, that's why we use this title, that's where prayer becomes real, because now suddenly you're praying for what your heart really desires and what your heart really worries about. You're actually entering into the real anxieties of life, the real worries. God, I'm worried that if I ask for prayer, if I ask for healing for my friend, I'm worried you're not going to do anything. I'm just worried you're not going to show up here. I'm worried again to be disappointed. Whenever I ran into those things in my prayer life, early on in my life, for most of my Christian life, probably, I immediately turned to either self-correction or just a kind of self-meditation. Like, why do I think those things? Should those things are those things true? Why do I worry about this? And suddenly now I'm supposedly, I'm just talking to myself, right? And it never occurred to me maybe I should tell God I'm worried he won't show up in my life. And I think as a young believer, if someone even would have encouraged me to do that, I'm not sure I could have, because I had these crazy notions of God in my mind, that God was holding this lightning bolt, this ready, I dare you to say it. You go one more inch in that direction. And it's been so instructive for me as a seminary professor to watch my students in this regard, because my students come in, and whether they're philosophy students or theology students, and they're spending a lot of time really trying to get the doctrine of the atonement right. Like, what did Christ's cross really achieve? And they think about it, they get the language right, and then they go to pray, and all of that gets thrown out the window, and they try to atone for their own sins in prayer. And much of their spiritual life is them trying to atone for their own sins. And for many of them, what they do, and exactly what I did when I was them, all those years ago, is they go into prayer and they turn against themselves, and they start kind of berating themselves in prayer, because the fantasy is maybe God will look at me and see that I'm being harsh on myself, and he won't be harsh to me. And the problem with all of that is it's paganism. Like that, there's just nothing Christian about any of this. Now we're trying to manipulate the deities to try to get them on our side. And what isn't happening is I'm not drawing near because of what Christ has done. And that is where we need to bring all of these struggles, all of these disappointments, all of these worries, all of this anger. Like, it needs to come in. And if we clean it up, what we're really telling God is, here's the stuff you can have, and here's the stuff you cannot have. And I'm going to keep this I'll take care of this, and I'll kind of fix this stuff. And unfortunately, that tends to be all the stuff that actually is the very stuff we need to bring into the presence of God, where we need to know his grace and his mercy and his forgiveness.